Hi, I'm Pastor Christine Kirchner, pastor at Mountain Grove Lutheran Parish in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. And this is our third video in our Bible study series, Consider the Birds. And so this series is based off of the book, Consider the Birds by Debbie Blue. This week, we are studying the bird in Hebrew. That is the nesher. I might not be saying that totally 100% right. It's N-E-S-H-E-R. My Hebrew pronunciation was always awful in seminary, so might be not the best pronunciation, but that's what I'm gonna go with. But we're talking about neshers today, and the reason why I have not told you what the English version of the word is because that there's some controversy around what bird nesher actually refers to. And so in almost all of our English Bibles, or not almost, in all of our English Bibles, nesher means eagle. And yet, if you go to Israel and ask a native Hebrew speaker what nesher means, apparently most people will answer vulture, specifically the griffin vulture. And so there's quite a bit of controversy around whether nesher means eagle or vulture. Some of that has to do with when the Old Testament was translated into Greek. The Greeks, much like European and Westerners, didn't like the vulture much. And so when Isaiah talks about, or when Isaiah in Exodus talks about God lifting up the Israelites as on nesher's wings, they didn't like the sound of vulture's wings, so they put eagle. When the King James translation, the first English translation, was made, they stuck with the eagle translation. And yet, if you look at the Old Testament, there's quite a few times where eagle doesn't make the most sense, but griffin vulture does. There are also some times, though, when you see nesher, and eagle really does make the most sense for what they're talking about. And what I kind of think of, kind of like with here, there are different words for the same bird, even though they're different birds. So I use buzzard and vulture interchangeably. Makes my sister really upset because apparently they're two actually different birds and I should not use them interchangeably. And yet in my mind, nope, they're one and the same. I think that's kind of a little bit where you're going with here. They can be used for both. But because so much has been done with eagles, we're going to be looking at the vulture, the griffin vulture specifically. Now, when you think of the vulture, what images come to mind? Usually, right, they're not complimentary images, right? Vultures do not have a good reputation in Western society. They are generally considered gross and dirty. They're associated with death. They can even be seen as harbingers of death, right? How many old Western movies have you seen where it's the shot of the vulture circling in the sky, and then you pan down and you see the person down on the ground dying of thirst, barely about to make it, right? When you see vultures circling or congregating, you know if something's not already dead, then it's almost dead. And so seeing a bunch of vultures, then, we tend to associate vultures with trouble, dying, and death. Vultures are also then opportunistic at the expense of others. Right? In order for them to live and have a meal, something else has to die. And so they live at the expense of others. And so those are a lot of all of the images, right, that we have with vultures and the association that we have with vultures. They're gross, they're ugly, and they're too closely tied to death. Interestingly, though, not all cultures have the same negative association with vultures. The ancient Egyptians actually envisioned that the great mothering goddess was a vulture, and she was called Nekbet. And Nekbet would fly high above the world, and she could enfold all of creation in her giant wings. There's a quote in the Book of the Dead, and it says, "Mother of mothers, who existed from the beginning and gave birth to all that is." Really different word or association. This sense of mothering and care and enfolding in her wings. If you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, the picture of the vulture is actually one of the sounds used in the word mother and grandmother. And so when you see the word mother in Egyptian hieroglyphics, you also see a picture of a vulture. Not our normal association. And so, like I was saying earlier, it's not clear in the Old Testament if those really same negative associations with vulture are present in the Old Testament. And so that word nesher, well, we always see it as eagle. It could also be referring to the griffin vulture. And the griffin vulture has some actually pretty cool characteristics. They are the highest flying bird. The griffin vulture holds the Guinness World Book of Records for highest flight. And they recorded that flight because in 1973, a griffin vulture hit a commercial airplane that was flying at 37,900 feet in the air. So vultures go insanely high, or they can go insanely high, miles above the earth. That allows them to fly over storm clouds. So rather than having to take shelter in the midst of a really bad storm, they can fly above it. They reach those great heights, not by using the brute strength of their wings, but by catching thermal air currents. And so what happens is, as the sun hits the earth, it doesn't hit the earth all at the same intensity, right? There are shadows, like the north side of your house that never gets dry. And so that means the air is cooler in some places, warmer in others. And hot air rises up. And so what vultures will do, not just griffin vultures, and not just vultures, all birds, when they're catching the air currents, the hot air is lighter. It rises up faster than the cold air. And so the griffin vulture catches that current, and that's why they spiral, because they're staying in the current as they let the hot air lift them up. And so that's how they get this really high height. They have a 9-foot wingspan, and they can live up to 50 years. So especially if you're talking Old Testament lifespan, they live one generation. So they have a long lifespan. But the other thing with vultures, griffin vultures specifically, but all vultures in general, is that they have incredibly strong stomach acid. And so vultures can eat meat that is rotting and completely compromised or infested with bacteria and pathogens without getting sick. They can eat and consume all the things that would normally kill us. So they consume meat that would otherwise spread diseases, and they purify that which would have killed others. Now, this isn't about the griffin vulture, but the Mayans in Central America, they actually venerated vultures, and they referred to them as death eaters. And so you look at the vulture, and those are two very different understandings of the vulture's relationship with death, right? So for us as Westerners, their relationship with death taints them. It's almost like they bring the death on, even though they actually don't. But that's the association that we have. You look at other cultures, and it's more of this sense that they consume death. They take that which kills and makes it, right? They clean it up. They purify it. They keep it from killing us. That's a very different way of looking at the vultures. Now, when you're looking at the word nesher, nesher is used 27 times in the Old Testament. And it's used kind of in four main ways. The first one you see in Leviticus, where it's referred to as an unclean bird, not fit for consumption. So you shouldn't be eating neshers. But then there are other times where nesher is used as a symbol or a sign of speed and strength. So in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 23, the quote is, "Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than nesher. They were stronger than lions." We also see in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 8, "Their horses are swifter than leopards, more menacing than wolves at dusk. Their horses charge. Their horsemen come from far away. They fly like a nesher, swift to devour." So you have that sense of speed, swiftness, strength. But then you also have this sense, tapping into their long lifespan, of rejuvenation. They're a sign of revitalizing. So Psalm 103, verse 5 quotes, "Who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like the nesher." And then finally, the other main way that you see nesher being used is a symbol of protection. And that's what we're going to kind of get into with today. So you see it in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4. God is talking to the Israelites, and says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on nesher's wings and brought you to myself." And then you see in Isaiah 40, verse 31, "But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like nesher. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." So I want to look into that one. And for our Bible study today, we're going to be digging into Isaiah 40, verses 27 to 31. And we're going to sort of look at it mainly with the griffin vulture being referred to, because I think that provides a different understanding, or gives us a different angle into looking at this text. So we're going to read Isaiah 40, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 27 to 31. "Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like nesher, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So we have this passage in Isaiah, and it's part of a much larger passage giving comfort and reassurance to the Israelites. And in order to understand Isaiah is one of those books where you really have to know what's going on in the like sort of geopolitical history of the area in order to understand what Isaiah is talking about. So if you look even on a map today with where Israel sits in the globe, you can see, generally speaking, Israel is this little tiny section sandwiched between two major powers. And that stretches all the way back to its beginning. It's always been Egypt to the south as their sort of major political power to the south of them. But then as you go north, the country, the ruler in charge has changed. And so under King David, it was just the kingdom of Israel. It was one kingdom. But after the death of King Solomon, David's son, Israel split up. And so you have the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, which is north. And then you have the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And that is where Jerusalem is. And so then those two kingdoms separated 930, 925 or so BC. And so they've worked as two separate kingdoms during that time, as other countries came into power and fell out of power and threatening Israel the entire time. Finally, in 722 BC, the country or the nation of Assyria, the Assyrians gained power. And it is Assyria that overthrows the kingdom of Israel, that northern kingdom. And that's the last time we hear of the kingdom of Israel. And the Assyrians come and they threaten Judah. They're on the brink of invading Jerusalem, but they don't. And so they kind of end up going around the kingdom of Judah, but they continue down with their military conquest into Egypt. And that becomes important because they spread themselves out too thin. They're trying to fight too many battles in too many places. And that allows 100 years later for the Babylonians to come in. And so they rise in power and they overthrow the Assyrians. And it's the Babylonians who then come and conquer the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And they invade Jerusalem. The Babylonians invade Jerusalem 3 times in the decade of 580. The most tragic was in 587 BC. It was the second invasion that they had. That's the start of the Babylonian exile. And so during that second invasion of Jerusalem, they overthrow the Davidic king. And so there is no longer a Davidic king, right? The king of David. We no longer have David's ancestors, David's progeny on the throne. The religious leaders, the political leaders, they are all forced out of the country and taken into exile. And then the temple, the place where God met God's people, the footstool of God, was absolutely destroyed. And one of Babylon's main ways of keeping peace in countries that they have overtaken and who probably aren't the happiest to have the Babylonians as their rulers now, is that they would take the political religious leaders, the movers and shakers of the community, they would pull them out of that community and move them far away, either put them into Babylon or put them into another area that had been conquered, but it's sort of separating the people from their leaders, with the thought then that the leaders, they have no base to raise an upright, to inspire a riot, and the people have no leaders to get them into a riot, so they can't revolt against the Babylonians. But that means then that the Babylonian exile becomes this really important watershed moment in Israelite history. Because for so long, right, the covenant God made with Abraham, it's tied to the land. The covenant God makes with the Israelites, right? I will lead you to the promised land. I will give you this land where you will be my people. They no longer have that land. They no longer have the temple where they would go and meet God. And so much of their religious rituals are tied to the temple. And they can no longer observe those religious rituals. And then there's also the challenge, the concern, back then especially, when the belief was in lots of different gods. So different countries each had their own gods. And the idea was that, yeah, all these gods can coexist together, but then when you fought, whichever side won, their god was the strongest. The Israelites have been defeated. Does that mean that God isn't the strongest God? Hard questions like that, that the Israelites are really struggling with. Are they still God's people? Can God still care for them? And so that's what the Israelites are wrestling with when Isaiah writes our passage. So the book of Isaiah is a really long book. It's a large book. And it's believed that there are 3 different sections in Isaiah. Chapters 1 through 39 deal with the time before the exile. And so it's sort of the build up to be careful, this is coming, this is coming. Starting in chapter 40, where our lesson picks up, it shifts. The Israelites are now in exile, and Isaiah is writing to comfort them. Chapter 40 starts out, "Comfort, comfort now my people, so says your God." We hear that verse a lot coming up in Advent. The people who wait in darkness have seen a light. That all ties back, relates to with the Israelites living in exile. And so as Isaiah writes to the Israelites, he is reassuring them that God is still their God. It says, you say, your God does not know you're going out or you're coming in. And Isaiah responds, no, God is so much bigger than you can fathom. Of course, God is still in charge. Of course, God still knows you. Even when you can't go to the temple, even when you no longer live in the promised land, God is still your God. And that's where we get then that wonderful thing of reassurance that God will continue to care, that even though this is a really hard and trying time, God will give you strength so that you may rise as on wings of a nesher. And in our English, it's eagle, right? So that you may rise on wings like an eagle. And I don't know about you, but when I hear that with wings of an eagle, I think of a lot of strength and power. I also think of a really sort of direct flight, right? Like I know eagles circle a little bit, but not a whole lot. Their flight path is much more direct. They swoop down and they grab. And so if you think of it as wings of a nesher or wings of an eagle, those are kind of more of the images that you get. And yet, if we think of it as wings of a vulture, specifically a griffin vulture. Vultures don't have, well, they're still strong, right? They don't do that straight, powerful path. They circle round and round. And I think in that sense, you begin to see, yeah, the Israelites' path forward, our path forward, right? It is not a straight path. The way is not forward, is not always clear. Sometimes it can seem like we circle and cycle through. But also there's that sense then that the griffin flies at the highest of all the birds. So the sense that then the Israelites are able to fly above. But also then, what does it mean if the Israelites have wings of a nesher, right? Ride on wings of a nesher, and it is the vulture that consumes death. It is the vulture that purifies. I can't help but having that image and thinking Christ, right? Christ, who is the ultimate victor over death, who takes in all of those things that would kill us into himself so that we might live and live in relationship with God. And so in that sense, this idea then of the Israelites on wings of the vulture, it is God coming and taking all that separates them from God and flying above it, purifying it, cleansing it, and making it so that the Israelites will once again be able to live with God in the promised land. Fast forward to 500, 525, 530 something or so. The Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and the Persians have a much different sense of how to take over a country. Rather than pulling people out, they saw how well that worked with the Babylonians, and they decided to rather allow all those people to come back. And so it is the Persians who then have the Israelites, the exiled Israelites, come back to the land of Judah, rebuild the temple, and the people are able to be with God again. And so you kind of have that sense that I don't think you necessarily get with an eagle. So wrestle with that. Let me know in the comments what you think. I know it's a different way of looking at things, and it can be really hard to push the idea of the vulture as gross and disgusting out of our heads. If you need to do that, or if it's too hard, maybe just think griffin instead of vulture. But yeah, I want you to think about, wrestle with, what does it mean for God to lift us up on wings of a Death Eater, on something that purifies all that would kill us, so that we can live. I will be back next with our 4th video installment, and I will see you then.